Airbnb, a company worth over $70 billion. Whether you like them or not, you have to hear their story. Today, you won't see a tale of success. This will be a story of failures. Even the founders themselves said that Airbnb is the worst idea that ever worked.
In this episode, we'll learn how Airbnb was born through challenges and how they dealt with them so that you could use their experience in your business or career.
Oh, and you'll also learn why Airbnb could have never succeeded without breakfast cereal. Now, I'd like you to meet Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia. Back in 2007, they were 26-year-olds that recently graduated from design school and struggled to pay rent in San Francisco. That same year, in September, Joe Gebbia learned that a design conference was coming to town, and all the hotels were fully booked. Rent wouldn't pay for itself, so he came up with an idea and pitched it to his roommate Brian over email. Brian, I thought of a way to make a few bucks, turning our place into designers' bed and breakfast, offering young designers who come to town a place to crash, complete with wireless internet, a small desk space, sleeping mat, and breakfast each morning. Ha! Joe. With no further thinking, they created a WordPress blog, wrote to local bloggers to advertise, and within a day, they had 3 people who wanted to stay with them. There was a 35-year-old woman from Boston, a father of 4 from Utah, and a man from India. That weekend, they didn't only make $1,000, but also showed their guests around the city. They went together to the conference and made friends. The man from India even invited them to his wedding 2 years later. After their temporary tenants left, they thought this could be a genius idea for their startup. There were probably many people out there who had airbeds and needed extra money. They didn't work on it immediately. The plan was to provide accommodations for events. So they saw an upcoming South by Southwest conference and decided to create a new webpage. Brian and Joe asked their friend Nathan Bleckerchip to code a website. That's how their team of not yet entrepreneurs grew bigger. Nate became the 3rd and final co-founder of what we know today as Airbnb. But back in 2007, the platform was called Airbed and Breakfast. The initial idea was only to allow people to offer their airbeds for their guests. That was how they came up with the name. So they made this website. It was basically a directory of events where locals could put up their spare bedroom just for the time of the event, and those visiting the city could look it up. It took them about 3 weeks to put the website together, and they launched it a week before the South by Southwest conference in March 2008. They got about a dozen properties on the website, but only 2 people booked a place. One of them was Brian himself. He flew to Austin, Texas, and his host picked him up at the airport. His wife made them dinner. They had a nice airbed set up with chocolate on the pillow. The hospitality was wonderful, but at the end of the night, the host asked Brian if he had the money because this was before Airbnb accepted payment through their website. Brian said he would need to go to an ATM and asked if he could bring it tomorrow. The host saw no problem with that. But the next day, Brian forgot to withdraw cash again, and his host got a little suspicious. In the end, they were complete strangers who met over the internet. This situation made Airbnb's founders realize that it would be great to avoid all the possible mess with cash by simply making payments upfront online. While they've been struggling to scale their platform, people started to ask if they could use Airbed and Breakfast without visiting events. The answer was no, because there were trust issues. If a guest showed up for a conference, the host had more confidence than what they didn't know why the person was coming to town. But then they thought it would be great to make their platform as easy as booking a hotel. You could go to the homepage, type in a destination, see some search results, and hopefully find something suitable. And if you liked it, you could book it in 3 clicks. So in the summer of 2008, they were ready to launch again. Yes, Airbnb launched multiple times, but the founders saw it as an opportunity.
There's a saying that if you launch and no one notices, just launch again. So we did.
There they were, debuting once again, right before the Democratic National Convention, where the party nominated Barack Obama for the presidency. It was a big event. The venue could fit 80,000 people. but there were only 17,000 hotel rooms available in Denver. So Airbnb founders rushed to build their website. Many locals wanted to get out of town during the convention and make some extra money. That's why they got 800 people to put up their properties on the website within a week. Many wanted to join the event, but the media was constantly reporting the accommodation shortage. So that was the perfect time to inform several local newspapers about the 800 extra spots on Airbnb and breakfast. The news quickly reached even national TV, and that weekend they received over 80 bookings. They were glorified. But in 2 weeks, the reservations went back to zero. Unluckily for Airbnb and breakfast, political conventions weren't happening every week. The company's founder kept on funding their business with credit cards, and at some point, they had no money to pay for food. So as they were positioning themselves as a bed and breakfast, they decided to concentrate on the breakfast part of their business. The easiest thing to add as a breakfast option in rentals was cereal. The idea was that the host could order these cereals and offer them as breakfast to their guests. Little did they know that years later, these cereal packs will become collector pieces sold for hundreds of dollars on eBay. Back then, they needed cash, and they needed it fast. So they found an artist who created designs, asked their friends at the printing shop to make 1,000 boxes for royalties, and hand glued all of those boxes by themselves in the kitchen of their apartment. Then they found the cheapest dollar cereal out there and repacked it into their boxes. They knew people will buy their breakfast for the design, not for the product itself. What design was that? Well, given that it was during the McCain-Obama election, they created Obama's O's Breakfast for Change and Captain McCain Maverick Square Puffs.
And what's great about these cereals though is, they're very elaborate.
After they appeared on national TV, they were sold out in days, making over $30,000 to fund their business. While the production price of one pack was no more than $4, they sold each unit for $39. But of course, $30,000 couldn't bring them out of debt, pay for their living expenses, and grow the business. They were trying to get investors to believe in their idea. Owning 10% of Airbnb stock today sounds like a good idea, but back in the day, everyone, literally everyone, was skeptical. That period was their era of rejection. Brian Chesky later said that their interviews with investors were a nightmare. Once, they met with an angel investor at a well-known cafe in Palo Alto, and they were pitching him. He was sipping his smoothies and then suddenly got up and walked out, leaving half of his drink.
We had thought he had gotten up to maybe just put some money in the parking meter and he was going to come back.
But he never did. In total, Airbnb founders were interested in 20 investors, but 15 of them didn't even reply to their emails. They were basically at the point of deciding whether they should give up and quit. It was almost a year of trying. And whatever they did, they were still only making $200 per week from Airbnb and breakfast. But then one of their advisors suggested they apply to Y-Combinator, a tech startup accelerator. And surprise, surprise, they got rejected again. However, these three entrepreneurs were anything but quitters. So they contacted the program's founder, Paul Graham, directly and convinced him to meet with them in person. Chesky and Gebbia traveled to Boston to see Graham. The investor had two questions for the young entrepreneurs.
In fact, he said, people are actually doing this? And I said, yeah. And the second question was, what's wrong with them?
The interview went downhill from there. They were about to leave the meeting, but then Joe Gebbia took out a pack of Obama cereal. Graham asked, what was that? And the entrepreneurs explained that as no one wanted to fund their business, they had to come up with a solution. Graham was impressed, and he knew that not every startup could survive the nuclear winter after the financial market crash. He needed indestructible cockroaches. So the investor responded, well, if you make people buy a $4 cereal for $39, maybe you can convince them to sleep at a stranger's home.
He saw that with the breakfast cereal, we could figure out how to do anything. And that's how we got into Y-Combinator.
Then they started the intense training. Later, Graham, in his blog post, revealed that no one ever worked harder during Y-Combination than the Airbnbs did. They always took notes of every piece of advice, implemented changes immediately, and had a lot of energy. And now they proudly showcase their successful Airbnb investment on the accelerator's web. But back in 2008, Paul Graham couldn't see the idea's potential. Once, he asked the Airbnb founders where their users were, and they didn't know what to answer because they could be anywhere. So he reframed the question by asking where they had the most users at that time. It was in New York. Graham told them to go to New York and meet older hosts. They didn't understand why they would need it. Plus, they had no spare money to cover travel expenses. But the trip definitely paid off.
So over the course of 4 different weekends, they went to New York to meet older users. At the time, they only had 20 or 30 hosts in the city, so it wasn't a big deal. And they noticed that their hosts had terrible photos of their properties. Remember, it was 2008 and phone cameras weren't as good as today. So most of the pictures were dark and had low resolution. They decided to solve this issue by renting a professional camera and going to the properties to take good quality pictures. They would then invite hosts for a beer afterwards, and as a result, they ended up getting feedback and also giving some advice on how to improve their profile descriptions and establish proper pricing. This worked. Hosts wanted to cooperate, and guests from around the world started booking these properties in New York. The landlords began making money, and word of mouth did precisely what it had to do. The hosts would tell their friends, and the travelers will return to their countries and become hosts as well. As Airbnb already set a high bar with good photos and descriptions, people saw the standard for publishing new properties.
It took Airbnb 4 years to get the first 4 million guests. And now they'll reach a point of 1.4 billion all-time guests that stay with them, as well as 6.6 million active listings worldwide. But during these years, they faced many difficulties with their sharing economy business. The big challenge Airbnb had to deal with was the strangers issue. Because generally, a home is an intimate place where people don't let in someone they barely know. No one wanted to be the first to join the platform, even if they thought the idea was great. And then it became a vicious circle. Owners didn't want to list their properties, and guests didn't see the point of going to the empty webpage. So Airbnb started to design for trust. Write profile descriptions help with that. And another thing humans value were reviews. Studies show that people are more likely to trust someone who has the most similarities with them. But as soon as you add reviews to the equation, everything changes, and the trust issues dissolves.
With the right design, people would be willing to overcome the stranger danger bias.
When Airbnb grew bigger, an additional challenge appeared. More and more big rental companies started to publish their properties on the platform, and it got harder for private owners to get a good rating as they only had one property. So it took them much longer to receive reservations. That's why Airbnb decided to help newcomers hosts by creating an initiative, Superhost Ambassadors. This is a free program for new hosts where experienced Airbnb landlords become mentors and share tips and tricks on how to make a good profile and property description. Another major issue Airbnb faced was regulations. It turned out they were out of law in many regions. The company got legal challenges from lawmakers in several countries. They were concerned about the impact of short-term rentals on local housing markets and neighborhoods. For example, in New York, renting out an apartment for less than 30 days is illegal if the owner is not present. And similar laws apply far beyond the US. But Brian Chesky happened to have an interesting approach to this issue. Instead of trying to concentrate on those government officials that liked him, he faced the ones that didn't. He learned this lesson from the first executive he hired, Belinda Johnson, now the COO of Airbnb. She advised Chesky to meet with those who didn't like him because it's hard for people to hate up close. So he started to meet with the government officials, and sometimes the interviews would start a little hostile. But Chesky took an approach of being a careful listener and trying to understand the other side. He believed that respecting people and listening to them is 90% of success. Later, Airbnb representatives realized that every city had different laws and they couldn't find a one-fit-all solution. So they started meeting with hundreds of cities. And now Airbnb had a regulation in place for 90% of the top 200 markets. They have also collected $6 billion of transit tax since they started. The solutions were different for every location. For example, in densely populated cities, Airbnb deepened the housing shortage because many landlords prefer renting out their homes as short-term rentals. The way to fix this problem was by ensuring that people only rented out the places where they lived. So Airbnb will create a registration system, set a limited number of nights hosts could rent out, or maybe ask them to show proof of residence. Also, the company proposed handling a hotel tax for city improvement. So everything seemed in order, but another crisis was on the way, the pandemic. Airbnb lost 80% of its revenue over 8 weeks in March and April 2020. They had to lay off nearly 2,000 employees. At some point, the media were guessing if that was the end of Airbnb, and hosts referred to that time as the Airbnb apocalypse. The company's co-founders said that after the drop, they had a near-death business experience when their lives flashed before their eyes. Before we check how Airbnb navigated through this crisis, let's go a while back, a few months before the pandemic. It was late 2019, and the company was preparing to go public. All three founders, Brian, Joe, and Nate, went for a hike. They were reflecting on how big the company got. At the time, it was valued at $30 billion, and the entrepreneurs couldn't help but be proud of themselves. But something was off. Brian Chesky said that it felt like Airbnb was an adolescent in an adult body. Even though everything seemed fine, the company's growth was slowing while costs were rising. They had 10 divisions at Airbnb, such as a homes division, experiences, transportation, a magazine, etc. And then each division had subdivisions. The business got so spread all over that they ended up having 10 marketing departments. They were building software like most tech companies do by decentralizing as much as possible to allow people to move quickly. But instead of fast-paced growth, they were getting stuck in bureaucracy, where it was difficult to get work done, and they didn't know what to do. Brian mentioned that he was slightly horrified because this was not the company they set up to build, but the IPO was coming up, and obviously they couldn't rebuild the company from zero. So they went into the new year thinking of some changes, and all of a sudden, the pandemic hit. Airbnb reduced the size of their companies, the executives' pay, and marketing expenses from nearly $1 billion to zero. Basically, Brian Chesky became their marketing department, doing press interviews. He managed to have 100 of them that year. And on top of all that, the company was weeks away from what was supposed to be one of the hottest IPOs in years. So how did Airbnb manage this? First, they established several principles, such as act fast, preserve cash because it was like oxygen, act with all stakeholders in mind, and play to win the next travel season and to always look forward no matter what. In addition, they also made several institutional changes. Airbnb reduced all the projects they were working on at that company just to a few things.
I wanted only leaders that were going to be in the details. I didn't want anyone that was just a manager of people.
And it looks like they made it. At least that's what the numbers show. The year before the pandemic, Airbnb was unprofitable. They were making money, but their spendings were higher. But in 2022, they managed to grow their revenue and cut expenses. Despite showing record revenue in 2022, Airbnb stock was down 49%. Experts say that it happened partially due to the slowing economy and the rising interest rates. Investors know that this can impact the company's growth. But after learning the story of Airbnb, even looking at this downtrend seems like they figure it all out, somehow in the most unpredictable way. Irish author Samuel Beckett once said, "Try again, fail better." If he lived in the time of Airbnb creators, you could think that those three young founders inspired Beckett to come up with this legendary saying. Although Airbnb's story is full of failures, seeing them never give up, it's very inspiring. What was the most shocking fact for you? Let me know down in the comment section below. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.